Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you're new here, this channel exists for one reason, so that the next person who books that flight, or wires that first transfer, or signs that document in a foreign language, walks in knowing something they didn't know before. Most of the time we talk about relationships, about men who came here looking for connection and found something more complicated. But today's story is different. Today's story is about property, about paperwork, about a man who did his research, structured his deal carefully, documented everything, and still lost the house he'd built with his own money. His name is Wolfgang. He's 61 years old. He's from the Ruhr Valley in western Germany. He spent 27 years in IT support. The kind of man who fixes things, tracks things, keeps records. The kind of man, honestly, who you'd expect to see through a scam before it got started. And that's what makes this one worth your time. Because if it can happen to Wolfgang, it can happen to anyone who walks into this country thinking that preparation is the same thing as protection. I'm not going to tell you how it ends. I want you to hear it from him. Here's his story, in his own words. My wife's name was Ingrid. I'll say that once, and then I'll move on, because that's how she would have wanted it. She was not a woman who liked fuss. We were married 31 years. She died in October 2021, and the 4 years before that. I don't have good words for those years. Not in German, not in English. You manage, you schedule. You learn the names of every nurse on the oncology ward, and which one will actually answer the call button and which one won't. You get very good at hospital car parks. You learn to eat a sandwich in a waiting room without tasting it. When it was over, I went home to a house in Essen that had become, without me noticing, entirely organized around her illness. The spare room was medications. The kitchen had a chart on the refrigerator with dosage times. Every surface had a purpose that no longer existed. I walked through it for about a week, and then I called an estate agent. People assumed I was grieving. I was, but I was also being practical. The house was capital. I was 59 years old. My German pension would begin at 61. Not large, but reliable, as pensions are when the state manages them properly. I had roughly 155,000 euros from the sale after costs. That is not a fortune. In Germany, or England, or anywhere with a real property market, it evaporates quickly. You do the maths, and it makes you tired. So I opened Excel. I am not embarrassed to tell you this. Excel is a very good tool. I made a column for expected monthly costs, a column for visa stability, a column for English language capability, because my Spanish is non-existent, and my Tagalog was, at that point, also non-existent. I looked at Thailand first. Visa rules change there like weather. And there is a quality to the service culture in some of those tourist areas. Very friendly, very constant, slightly exhausting if you are a person who finds performance tiring. Vietnam I dismissed because the language barrier is real, and the tourist pricing, according to 6 months of forum reading, was becoming aggressive. The Philippines passed enough of my filters. English-speaking, genuinely, not just in hotels, relatively stable, cost of living numbers that, if the forums were accurate, would allow 155,000 euros to last considerably longer than in Europe. And the forums were large, organized, full of men who had made this move and were willing to be specific about the numbers. I joined 3 Facebook groups before I booked any flight. I read archived posts going back 2 years. I did not post anything personal. I asked about electricity costs in Cebu versus Manila, about mobile data providers, about whether the SRRV visa was worth the deposit or whether rolling tourist visa extensions were more flexible. People answered. Good answers, mostly. Detailed. I identified Cebu as the right base, smaller than Manila. Less noise, less traffic, better air in the outlying areas. Closer to islands, I told myself I might eventually visit. I booked a 6-month stay, not a move, an assessment, a pilot program, if you want to call it that. I would go, evaluate, and decide with data rather than sentiment. I arrived in January 2023. Mactan Cebu Airport at midday, which I would not recommend. The heat is a physical thing. It is not the dry heat some people prefer. It is the other kind, the kind that makes your shirt a problem immediately. I had arranged accommodation remotely, a studio apartment in Lahug, clean and functional, 4th floor with a window that caught some breeze. A German company ran the booking platform, which I found reassuring for no rational reason. The first 2 weeks I spent alone, methodically. I walked the same route every morning at 6 before the heat became serious. I found a bakery. They make this bread called pandesal, soft, slightly sweet, about 4 or 5 pesos each. I went every morning. The woman behind the counter started putting 2 extra in the bag, without being asked after the first week. I thought that was kind. It is a small thing. I remember it more than I probably should. I found the supermarket. I found the wet market, which is louder and cheaper and takes some adjustment. I updated my spreadsheet. Actual costs were tracking within 8% of projected, which is acceptable variance. I felt, I would say, approximately 40% settled. For me, in that period of my life, 40% was quite good. I had started posting in one of the Facebook groups. Still practical questions. Nothing personal, nothing about loneliness, which was real, but was not a topic I intended to discuss with strangers on the internet. I asked about property, not because I had decided anything, but because I wanted to understand the legal structure. Foreigners cannot own land in the Philippines. I knew this already. What I wanted to understand was the lease arrangement options, the legal protections available, how other men had navigated it. Several people replied. One reply was more detailed than the others. The man said he knew a property contact in Cebu. Not a big agency, he said. No flashy office, but someone who actually knew the title registry process and wouldn't waste your time with overpriced condos. He said the man's name was Reginald. He said Reginald was no nonsense and actually shows up. I sent Reginald a message that evening. He replied within the hour. Punctual already. I noted this. Reginald suggested we meet at a cafe in IT Park. You know IT Park. It's this business district in Cebu City. Glass buildings and fast food chains and young people in lanyards eating at the Mang Inasal on their lunch break. Not the Philippines I'd seen in the forums, which tended toward beaches and sunsets. This was offices, air conditioning. I found it more comfortable, honestly. He was already there when I arrived, which I registered as a point in his favor. 40-something polo shirt with a small logo I didn't recognize, a folder on the table. Actual paper, printed documents, tabbed. He stood and shook my hand with the correct amount of pressure. No performance. He said something like, "Good to meet you. I hear you're doing your research properly." I said yes. He said, "Good. Most people don't." We talked for nearly 2 hours. He knew the ownership rules precisely. He explained that a foreigner in the Philippines cannot hold title to land under any circumstances, but can own a condominium unit provided the building's foreign-owned proportion stays under 40%. He explained that long-term lease agreements were the standard alternative for men in my situation. He used the word transparent 4 times. I counted. Not because it seemed suspicious. At the time, it seemed like a good habit. He talked about the registry of deeds, about the difference between a tax declaration and an actual clean title, about why some properties in the provincial areas had complicated histories going back 3 or 4 generations. I scheduled a second meeting before I left the cafe. At the second meeting, he brought someone with him. He introduced her as his office administrator, the person who handled the documentation side of things. Her name was Maribel. She was 41, I learned later. She sat down without ceremony, set her bag on the floor, and opened a notebook. Not a phone, a notebook. She answered 2 questions I asked with direct answers, and said I don't know once when I asked something about a specific barangay's zoning classification, and said she would check and send me the information by Thursday. She did. Thursday, 11 in the morning, an email with 2 attachments. I want to be careful about how I describe this. I am aware that what I found attractive was essentially competence, orderliness, the absence of unnecessary noise. These are possibly not sophisticated criteria for trust, but I am a man who spent 27 years in IT support, which means I spent 27 years distinguishing between people who actually understood the problem and people who were performing the understanding of the problem. Maribel understood, or she performed it so well that I could not tell the difference, and I would like to think my calibration is reasonable. She didn't try to charm me. This is the thing I keep coming back to. Every other interaction I'd had in those first weeks, in shops, in the grab cars, at the Visa extension office, had a quality of performed warmth that I recognized intellectually as genuine Filipino hospitality, and that I also found, after a while, slightly pressurizing, like I was always being welcomed somewhere and wasn't sure what was expected of me in return. Maribel didn't do that. She was there to work. So was I. It was the first time in Cebu I felt something like being on solid ground. Over the following 3 weeks, I looked at properties with Reginald, 5 of them. A condo unit in a development near Ayala Center, Cebu, too expensive, and the foreign quota in the building was already at 36%, which he pointed out I should verify before putting any money down. A house being offered on a lease-to-own structure that turned out to have a tax declaration instead of a proper TCT. He flagged this himself. 2 other properties in Mandaue that weren't right for different reasons. A 4th I don't remember clearly. None of them worked, and I was beginning to think the search would go on for months, which was fine. I had time. I was still within my 6-month assessment window. Then, one afternoon, Maribel mentioned something. We were in a Jollibee on Osmeña Boulevard. Reginald had gone to make a phone call, and we were waiting. She mentioned, without particular emphasis, that her family had land in Consolacion, a lot her mother owned. She'd been saving for some years to build there. She had a partial foundation already poured, about a year old, stalled because the construction money ran out. She said it almost as an aside, like she was explaining why she understood the property market from a different angle. She wasn't asking me anything. I want to be precise about that. She did not say, "Would you be interested?" She did not suggest anything. She told me, factually, that this situation existed. I asked if I could see it. She looked slightly surprised. Then she said, yes. We drove up to Consolacion the next Saturday. It's maybe 30 minutes north of Cebu City on the highway. Less if the traffic cooperates. The lot was on a quiet street behind a row of sari-sari stores, neighbors on both sides, a basketball half-court visible 2 houses down. They are everywhere. Every barangay has one. It is the one constant in this country. The lot itself was maybe 250 square meters. Flat. The foundation was there, a concrete rectangle with rebar still sticking up in places, starting to rust slightly at the tips. I photographed everything. I have a systematic approach to this. I take photos in a fixed sequence so I can reconstruct the full picture from the images later. I measured the foundation with the tape measure I had in my bag. I noted the orientation relative to sun and prevailing wind. I asked to see the land title. Reginald produced a photocopy. The land was registered in Maribel's mother's name, an older woman I hadn't met yet, and appeared to have a clean title, TCT, no encumbrances listed. I drove back to La Hague that afternoon and built a new tab in my spreadsheet. The construction cost projections I developed over the next 2 weeks, cross-referenced against 3 different sources: 2 expat forum discussions about provincial house builds, 1 quote I requested independently from a contractor whose name I found through a different Facebook group. Numbers were consistent within a reasonable range. A house of the size I was considering, 3 bedrooms, solid concrete construction, proper electrical and plumbing, would run somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pesos. At the exchange rate that month, that was roughly 42 to 50,000 euros. 47,000 was the figure Reginald eventually quoted, which landed in the middle of my range. I noted this as a point of credibility. I told myself I was not being naive. I had done the research. I understood the legal structure. I knew I could not own the land. What I could own, I told myself, was the arrangement, the documentation, the lease, the right of first refusal. The system, properly constructed, was the protection. And I believed this. I genuinely believed this. That, I think, was the mistake that contained all the other mistakes. I want to tell you how the proposal came together, because I think about the sequence of it quite often. Not with pride anymore, but I do think about it. I came back to Reginald 3 days after visiting the Consolation lot. I told him I was not interested in the original arrangement Maribel had described, where I would essentially provide a loan to complete her construction and hope for informal repayment. That structure had no legal protection. Anyone who has read even one forum post about foreigner money in the Philippines knows that an informal loan to a local, secured against nothing, is not a loan. It is a gift with extra steps. What I proposed instead was this: I would fund the complete build from foundation to finish. The house would be titled in Maribel's name as required by law, but I would hold a notarized long-term lease, 25 years, renewable, with an exclusivity clause preventing the property from being sold, transferred, mortgaged, or encumbered without my written consent. And I would hold right of first refusal on any eventual sale at independently assessed market value. I drafted these terms myself in an email with numbered points. I sent it to Reginald and copied Maribel. Reginald called me the next morning and said, "This is very thorough." He said he had not seen a foreign client structure a deal this carefully. He said he would have his documentation person prepare the formal agreement. And yes, the documentation person was Maribel. I did not register this as a problem. She was the administrator. That was her job. I should have hired someone whose job was to work for me. I know this now. Every person I consulted during the structure of that deal was introduced by Reginald. The notary who prepared the lease agreement, introduced by Reginald. The contractor, also introduced by Reginald. Though I did run my own price check, I thought I was being careful. I was being careful about the numbers and trusting on the people. This is, I think, my characteristic error. The lease agreement was 4 pages. I read it 3 times. The exclusivity clause was in Clause 7. It referenced Maribel's mother, Erlinda, as the registered landowner and bound her and any future registered holder to the terms. That last phrase, any future registered holder, I understood to mean the clause would carry forward. It did not mean this. I know now that Philippine property law requires explicit successor-binding language that was absent from that clause. 1 sentence. If someone had written 7 more words, I would have been protected. Nobody wrote those 7 words, and nobody whose job was to protect my interests read the document to notice they were missing. I am not a lawyer. I accept this, but I should have paid one to be my lawyer. I did not. The first transfer went through on a Tuesday in late April. 320,000 pesos, about 5,300 euros, to clear the remaining debts on the existing foundation. Structural rebar, unpaid labor from the original pour. Reginald had the receipts ready before I asked for them, which again I read as professionalism. The second transfer followed 2 weeks later, 580,000 pesos, roughly 9,600 euros, for the materials deposit and the contractor retainer. I made both through Wise to a Philippine bank account I'd opened at a BDO branch in Lahug. Construction began in May. I want to be honest about what the next 5 months were like because I don't want to give the impression that I was anxious or suspicious. I wasn't. I was engaged. Genuinely engaged. I went to the site every Saturday morning, usually arriving by 8 before the heat became a problem. I brought coffee sometimes from a 7-Eleven near the highway. The construction crew, 8 men at peak, fewer some weeks, were professional enough. The foreman's name was Anding. He was a quiet man who communicated through Maribel, though his English was functional. I developed a working relationship with him over those months. He told me once, through Maribel translating what wasn't necessary to translate, that I was the most prepared Kano he had seen on a build site. I took this as a compliment. In a certain light, it is a very Filipino compliment, polite, true, and slightly revealing about what he had seen from foreign clients before me. The mid-build tranche went through in July, 900,000 pesos, which was 14,900 euros. The walls were up, the roof structure was framed. I photographed everything on the same weekly schedule. Dated photos, labeled, filed in folders, organized by month, and then by section of the build. Foundation, walls, roof, electrical rough-in, plumbing. I still have all of these. There was one period of delay in August. Heavy rains that stopped work for 11 days. Not unusual, Maribel said. She was correct. The typhoon season is real, and the construction schedule accounted for it. There were 2 material substitutions I approved. A different brand of ceiling board, and a change in the electrical conduit specification that the contractor said was equivalent. I asked questions about both. I got answers I could verify. I verified them. In September, Maribel's mother needed a medical procedure, a gallbladder operation, arranged at a private hospital in Mandaue. 85,000 pesos, which was approximately 1,400 euros. Maribel mentioned it without asking. I'm also not sure I gave her adequate time not to ask. I said, "Send me the hospital details and I'll transfer today. I will call this a separate matter." It was, technically. It was not, in any meaningful sense. The final construction tranche came in October. 1 million pesos, 16,600 euros. The house was complete. I walked through it on a Saturday morning with Anding and Maribel, and it was a good house, solid. The floors were tiled in a pale gray. The kitchen had proper ventilation. The third bedroom, which I had already earmarked as an office, had a window facing away from the street that caught the afternoon breeze. The terrace was covered. There was a garden area at the front that needed work, but had potential. Total build cost, 2.8 million pesos, 46,400 euros, approximately, at the rates I was getting that month, plus the 1,400 euros medical payment. Plus smaller amounts I won't specify because they blur together now. Fuel for site visits, materials I bought directly when something was needed quickly. A meal for the crew on the day the roof was finished, which Maribel suggested and which I thought was appropriate. I stood in the completed house on that Saturday in October, and took a photograph of the front from the street. I remember thinking, this is done. The problem is solved. I had found a place. I had structured it correctly. I had a 25-year lease with an exclusivity clause. I had a shared folder with 843 photographs. I felt briefly like a man who had managed something difficult and done it well. You will understand by now that this is not how the story goes, but I want you to understand that the feeling was real. And it lasted for a while. That's the part that stays with you. Not the loss, exactly. The feeling that came before it. I moved in on a Saturday in November. I had one suitcase and a laptop bag and a box of kitchen items I'd been accumulating in the La Hug apartment over the previous 10 months. A good knife, a small coffee press, 2 ceramic mugs I'd bought at a night market in Collins Street for reasons I can't fully explain. I drove up to Consolacion in a rented car I'd arranged to return the same day. Anding met me there with the keys. The house smelled of fresh paint and cement, and something underneath that, the particular smell of a building that hasn't been lived in yet. It's not unpleasant. It is a specific smell. It meant that everything was still possible. I had decided on the layout before the walls were finished. The largest bedroom was mine. The second bedroom I left empty. I had no plans for it. The third, the one with the afternoon window, became the office. I set up my desk and my monitors within 2 days and had my remote IT work running by Wednesday. Small jobs, nothing major, but it maintained structure. That mattered more than the money, which at that point was still adequate. I had roughly 96,000 euros remaining of my original capital after the build costs and various expenses. The pension would start in February. I could see the numbers working. The neighborhood was quiet in the way provincial barangays are quiet, not silent. Nothing is silent in the Philippines, but a different sound to the city. Roosters, which start earlier than anyone warns you. Church bells from somewhere behind the highway. The specific sound of a television through a wall. And the specific sound of someone's karaoke machine down the street most Friday evenings. I had a neighbor who favored very old Filipino ballads and was not technically gifted but was consistent. I found, after a few weeks, that I had stopped noticing it. Maribel came by the first weekend to help with some practical things, where the water meter was, how to manage the electricity billing, who to contact at the barangay hall if there was a maintenance issue. She brought pancit in a container her mother had made. She said it was for good luck in a new home. I knew enough by then about Filipino custom to understand this was genuine, not performance. I thanked her. We ate it at the kitchen table, the first meal in the house, and I did not think very much about what that meant at the time. By December, we were eating together several evenings a week. She would arrive around 6, sometimes with something she had cooked, sometimes with ingredients, and an expectation that we would cook together. I am not a bad cook. I managed the meals at home for the last 2 years of Ingrid's illness, when she could no longer manage it. So this suited me. We developed a kind of domestic efficiency together. She didn't ask about my past. I didn't ask about hers, not much. I knew she had been widowed some years before. I knew she had a younger brother whose education she was managing. I knew she went to Mass at a small church in Mandaue on Sunday mornings, and that this was not negotiable. By January 2024, it had become something. I did not name it, and neither did she. I want to be accurate about this. I was not deceiving myself about what it was. I knew it was complicated. I knew there were things about the situation I didn't fully understand. Cultural things. The way a man in my position fits into a framework that has existed here long before I arrived. I knew that when her brother needed his university enrollment fees in late January, 42,000 pesos, about 700 euros, and she mentioned it in a way that was not quite a question, I approved the transfer in approximately 4 minutes without discussion. I did not begrudge this. I understood it as part of something. Then in February, a section of the roof on her mother's adjacent structure, a smaller concrete building where Erlinda lived, developed a leak. Structural. The estimate for repair was 65,000 pesos, roughly 1,075 euros. Maribel mentioned it. I transferred the money. She said, "Thank you." It was not a scene. These things happened in a way that felt, and I have thought about the right word for this, calibrated. Never dramatic, never urgent in a way that would cause examination. Just steady, like a tide. I want to be fair here, because I think this matters. I do not know with certainty that Maribel calculated this. The family obligations I was covering, the university fees, the medical costs, the roof repair. These are real obligations in this country. The eldest daughter in a Filipino family carries the weight of everyone. I have talked to enough people since to understand that. Maribel's mother was aging, her brother was in school, her late husband had left nothing useful. She was managing. I was there. I had resources. In a different story, this would simply be a man adjusting to the legitimate expectations of a different culture. I cannot tell you with confidence that it was not that story. This is the honest answer. What I can tell you is what happened in April. The first week of April, I tried to reach Reginald about something minor. A question about whether the land title had been updated to reflect the completed construction, which I wanted confirmed for my records. He did not reply to the message. I tried 2 days later. Nothing. I did not pursue it. Reginald was a property agent. I had no active transaction with him. Agents disappear between deals. This seemed unremarkable. There is an evening, a Tuesday, about 3 weeks into April, that I have replayed more than any other single moment. I was on the terrace. It was early evening, around 6, and the light at that time in Consolacion is this specific orange that comes in low and flat under the trees. I had a San Miguel and a book one wasn't really reading. The neighbor's television was audible. The rooster, 2 lots down, had been intermittently confused about the time of day. A man appeared at my gate. I recognized him, Maribel's uncle, a retired man named Efren, whom I had met briefly twice at family gatherings I'd attended. Quiet man. He had the look of someone who had decided to do something difficult, and was not sure he had made the right decision. He asked if he could come in. He sat down in the chair I indicated. He refused the beer I offered. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the table for a moment. And then he said, "Sir Wolfgang, something has happened with the title of the property. I think you need to know." He didn't know all of it. He said this clearly. He knew something had changed. He had heard things in the family, and he thought it was not right that I didn't know. He seemed embarrassed. He was embarrassed. In my experience, shame of that particular quality is not performed. It comes from a person who has made a decision that costs them something. I thanked him. He left. I called Maribel immediately. She did not answer. I called 3 more times over the next 40 minutes. She did not answer. I sat on the terrace until it was dark. The orange light went. The television next door switched to something louder. The karaoke down the street did not start that night, which I remember noticing. In the particular way you notice small irrelevant details when your mind is doing something else entirely. Then I went inside and opened my laptop and looked up the address for the Registry of Deeds in Cebu City. I would be there when it opened in the morning. The Registry of Deeds is on Osmeña Boulevard in Cebu City, on the ground floor of a government building that smells of old paper and floor wax and the particular staleness of rooms where important things happen slowly. I arrived at 8 in the morning when the doors opened. There was already a queue. I had written down the property details from my copy of the lease agreement, the TCT number, the lot number, the registered owner's name, Soriano, Erlinda R. I gave these to a woman at the counter who took them without particular interest and told me to wait. I waited 40 minutes. Then a man appeared with a printed record and placed it on the counter in front of me. I looked at it. The title was no longer registered to Erlinda Soriano. It had been transferred to a name I did not recognize. The transfer date was stamped in red, 12 weeks prior, January. While we were eating dinner together on Tuesday evenings, while I was approving university fees and roof repairs, I asked the man at the counter if I could speak to someone who could explain the document chain. He said I would need to pay for a certified copy and for a researcher to pull the associated records. I paid 500 pesos for the researcher, about €8, the most useful €8 I spent in the Philippines. I sat on a plastic chair in that corridor for another hour and a half. People walked past carrying folders. A ceiling fan turned above me without doing much. There was a small Jollibee cup on the floor that had been there, I suspected, since the previous week. I looked at my phone. Maribel had not called back. The researcher returned with 3 pages. I read them in sequence, the way you read a fault log when a system has gone wrong, looking for the point where the failure began. It had begun in November. The same month I moved in. The house, now completed and valued in the records at 3.1 million pesos, had been used as collateral for a private loan from a lending company. Not a bank, a private lender, in the amount of 900,000 pesos, about 14,900 euros. Then, in January, the title had been transferred to a person named Dindo Cabales. Later, I would learn he was a cousin, Maribel's mother's nephew, registered as a family conveyance. Not a sale, a family transfer. This is a different legal category, and it had been done deliberately, I would come to understand, to complicate any challenge. I sat with these 3 pages for some time. I called an attorney that afternoon. I found his name through a different Facebook group, not the one that had led me to Reginald. A legal advice thread for expats, and this attorney had been mentioned twice by different people as someone who actually knew property law. His office was in a building near SM City, Cebu. I was there by 2 o'clock. He read the lease agreement. He read it carefully, which took time, and I watched his face while he read it. His face did not change, which I did not find reassuring. When he finished, he set it down and explained the exclusivity clause problem in plain language. The clause named Erlinda. It bound Erlinda and, in the language used, any future registered holder. But Philippine property law, he explained, requires explicit language binding successors in title, specific words that were absent from Clause 7. The phrase used in my agreement was legally insufficient. Against a new registered owner, the exclusivity clause was unenforceable. He said this without apology, because it was not his error to apologize for. I asked him what my options were. He listed them. Barangay mediation first, mandatory before civil action, civil suit at the regional trial court challenging the transfer on grounds of fraud, a complaint to the NBY under the Estafa provisions of the revised penal code. He said the civil case had the strongest foundation if we could establish the transfer was made with fraudulent intent and that I had an existing right that was being deliberately circumvented. He said the criminal case was harder to prosecute but worth filing because it created pressure. I asked him to take the case. We agreed his retainer and I transferred the first payment that evening. 80,000 pesos, approximately 1,300 euros. Maribel came to the house that night. I don't know how she knew I'd been to the registry. Perhaps a friend told her. Perhaps someone saw me there. These things travel in provincial communities in ways that a German IT technician does not fully anticipate. She arrived at around 7. I heard the gate, and I went to the door. She was crying before she spoke. I want to be precise about this. She was not performing. She was genuinely distressed, or she is the most accomplished actor I have ever encountered, and I have been thinking about this question for 18 months without resolving it. She said Reginald had pushed her, that he had told her the loan was just temporary, that they would pay it back before I noticed, that the transfer to Dindo was just protection in case the lender came after the property. She said she hadn't understood what she was signing. She said she was sorry. She said she would fix it. I let her finish. I had my phone in my hand with the voice recorder running. I had started it when I heard the gate. I had done this not from some cunning plan, but because I am a man who documents things, and at that moment documentation seemed like the only useful response I had available. When she was done, I said, I do not want sorry. I want documentation of every transaction involving this property since the construction was completed. Every signature, every transfer instruction, every communication with the lender. I want it by Friday. She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I still cannot categorize. Then she left. She did not send documentation. She sent, 4 days later, a letter from a lawyer in Mandaue informing me that his client denied any fraudulent intent and would be seeking compensation for harassment. I sat at my desk in the office. The third bedroom, the one with the afternoon window, the one I had chosen because it caught the breeze, and I read this letter twice. Then I forwarded it to my attorney with a note saying, "We proceed." It was, I acknowledge now, the first decision in this entire story that I made entirely correctly. But I also want to tell you something else, and this is harder to say. When I sat there that evening after Maribel left, before the lawyer's letter arrived, before any of the legal process began, I was not primarily thinking about the money. I was thinking about the pancit on the kitchen table. The first meal in the house. The way she had said it was for good luck. I don't know what she intended. I am genuinely not certain. But I know that I miss having someone to eat with. And I know that this is separate from the legal question. And I know that these two things have been sitting in the same room in my head for a long time now, without resolving. I called my attorney back the same evening and told him, file everything. The barangay mediation was held in a small room at the barangay hall, about 10 minutes' walk from my house. Plastic chairs, a wall calendar from a local funeral parlor. The barangay captain sat at the head of a table and explained the process with the patient tone of a man who has explained it many times to people who did not want to be there. Maribel attended the first session. She sat across from me with her lawyer's assistant, not the lawyer himself, an assistant, and said very little. The barangay captain asked if there was willingness on both sides to reach an amicable resolution. Her assistant said they were open to dialogue. My attorney said we were open to a full reversal of the fraudulent transfer. There was a silence. Then we were told to return in 2 weeks. Maribel did not attend the second session. Her assistant arrived 20 minutes late and said his client was unwell. The barangay captain noted this in the record. We were issued a certificate confirming that mediation had failed, which was what my attorney needed to proceed to the regional trial court. The certificate cost 200 pesos. I have kept it. I want to explain to you what the next 14 months looked like, not because the legal details are entertaining, but because you should understand what pursuing justice in a foreign country actually requires from a person. The civil case was filed in May 2024. It alleged fraudulent conveyance, that the transfer of the title from Erlinda Soriano to Dindo Cabales had been made with intent to defeat my rights as a lessee. My attorney was methodical. He is a good attorney, and I say this without reservation. He was the one person in this entire situation who performed exactly the function I was paying him to perform. He filed correctly. He followed up consistently. He managed my expectations, which were, I will be honest, occasionally unrealistic. The Estafa complaint to the NBI was filed in June. This took 4 months to be formally acknowledged. I received a letter in October confirming the complaint was under investigation. Reginald was named in the complaint. By that point, he had not been reachable for 6 months. His Facebook profile had been deactivated. The mobile number I had for him returned a message saying the subscriber was unavailable. A contact in the expat group who had originally recommended him tried as well. Nothing. It was this contact, a British man named David, who had used Reginald for a legitimate property deal the previous year, who told me the other thing. He had been asking questions in the community. Someone who knew Reginald socially told him that Reginald and Maribel had been together for some years. The estimate was 6 years. The same 6 years during which Maribel had worked as Reginald's office administrator. The same role in which she had been introduced to me as a documentation specialist. The same role from which she had, with no apparent conflict of interest, drafted the lease agreement that protected me inadequately against the scheme she and Reginald had already designed. I sat with this for several days. I tried to work out the sequence. When the plan had been formed, whether it had been formed before or after they met me, whether the stalled foundation and the embarrassed mention of it in the Jollibee had been a prepared introduction or something that genuinely evolved, I could not determine this. I still cannot. In IT work, when you are trying to reconstruct a system failure, you can usually trace back to the original error because the logs exist. There are no logs for what people decide to do before they have decided to do it. What I know with certainty is the financial picture. My attorney compiled the full transaction record for the civil case. The private loan using the house as collateral, 900,000 pesos. The transfer to Dindo, structured as a family conveyance to avoid stamp duty and complicate legal challenge. The total value of the property as independently assessed at the time of the transfer, 3.1 million pesos. None of this money had come to me. All of it had originated from my transfers. The scheme, laid out in a legal document, was clear and, I admit, somewhat elegant in its construction. If you find that kind of thing admirable, which I do not. The civil judgment came in June 2025, 14 months after we filed. The regional trial court found that the transfer to Dindo Cabales constituted fraudulent conveyance under Philippine law and voided it. The title reverted to Erlinda Soriano. My lease was reinstated as valid against the original registered owner. Dindo, who my attorney had met twice during the process, and who appeared to be a genuinely bewildered man in his 50s who had believed he was receiving a legitimate family property arrangement, was ordered to return any documentation he held. He cooperated fully. He had been told, apparently, that it was a routine family transfer. I believe this. It is consistent with everything else I learned about how the scheme worked. The criminal case against Maribel remained unresolved when I left. The NBI investigation was ongoing. A warrant had been issued for Reginald. My attorney told me that criminal proceedings in the Philippines can take years and that I should not expect resolution quickly. I told him to continue as instructed and transferred his remaining fees before I left. The total legal cost across the full process was 380,000 pesos, approximately 6,300 euros. I sold the house in August 2025. I listed it through a different agent. A woman my attorney recommended, someone with no connection to anyone in this story, and accepted 2.4 million pesos, which was 700,000 pesos less than its constructed value, and considerably less than the 3.1 million pesos the assessors had valued it at before everything went wrong. The market in Consolation was not strong that year, and I was not willing to wait for a better offer. I wanted to finish. I transferred the proceeds. I calculated the total damage. Build cost minus sale price, 400,000 pesos, roughly 6,600 euros. Legal fees, 6,300 euros. The additional payments during the build and the relationship, the medical procedure, the university fees, the roof repair, the smaller amounts that blurred together, approximately 7,500 euros in total. Grand total somewhere between 18 and 22,000 euros, depending on how rigorously you account for currency fluctuation. My attorney's work recovered the property. It did not recover the money spent on it, the time spent inside the Philippine legal system, or anything else. I do not describe this as acceptable, but it is what it is. And 18,000 euros, painful as it is not the end of the story for me financially. I had 96,000 euros remaining when the problem began. I have less now. The pension started in January. I can calculate how long the remaining capital lasts at current rates. The numbers still work, if less comfortably. I flew back to Germany in October 2025. I booked a one-way ticket. I did not bring much. The coffee press, the 2 ceramic mugs from the night market in Colin Street. I left the kitchen knife. I don't know why. I live in a flat in Bochum now. 2nd floor. 2 kilometers, approximately, from the street where I grew up. I pass the house sometimes when I walk in the morning. Different family lives there, different curtains, a small trampoline in the garden that wasn't there before. I don't stop. There's no reason to stop. The pension started in January as scheduled. 1,340 euros per month, which is on the lower end of what I contributed for, because of the years I took at reduced hours during Ingrid's illness. Combined with the occasional remote work, I do IT support for a small logistics firm in Dortmund, 3 or 4 hours a week, nothing strenuous. I am managing. The spreadsheet still works. It is a less comfortable spreadsheet than the one I made in 2022, but the numbers are not impossible. People ask me if I regret going. This is the question everyone asks, eventually. I have thought about how to answer it accurately, and the accurate answer is no. Not going was not the error. The error was specific, and it was mine, and I can describe it precisely. The error was believing that a document I had not paid an independent professional to verify was a document I could rely on. In IT support, we have a phrase for this. We call it assuming the system is healthy, because it hasn't thrown an error yet. The system throws no error until it fails. The lease agreement looked correct. It was 4 pages, notarized, signed. It had clause numbers. I read it 3 times. None of these things made it adequate. The only thing that would have made it adequate was a qualified Philippine attorney who worked for me, not introduced by the other party, not a notary who prepared the document on request, mine, reading it before I signed and telling me that Clause 7 needed 7 more words. I did not do this. This is the whole story, reduced to its essential error. Everything else, Maribel, the relationship, the question of what she felt or didn't feel, the pancit at the kitchen table, the evenings on the terrace with the orange light, these are separate matters, real matters. But they are not the mechanism of the loss. The mechanism was the clause. I want to say something about Maribel, because I think it is important to be accurate here and not simply bitter. I still don't know with certainty what she intended or when she intended it, or how much of it was Reginald's direction, and how much was her own decision. I know that she and Reginald had been together for 6 years. I know the scheme required her participation at every stage: the introduction, the documentation, the lease, the loan, the transfer. I know she sent a lawyer's letter denying everything 4 days after telling me she was sorry and would fix it. These facts are not compatible with innocence. And yet, I think about Erlinda making the pancit, an old woman cooking noodles for good luck in a stranger's new house, because that is what you do in this country. Because hospitality and family obligation run so deep in Filipino culture that even in the middle of a fraud, her mother apparently still made the food. I think about Efren arriving at my gate, embarrassed, choosing to tell me because he thought it was wrong that I didn't know. I think about Dindo, the cousin, who cooperated fully with the court because he had genuinely believed he was helping his family and had no idea what he was part of. The Philippines is not a country of criminals. It is a country where people are poor, and where the gap between a provincial widow with an aging mother and a retired German with 155,000 euros is wide enough that decisions get made in that gap that people might not otherwise make. I am not excusing it, but I am also not willing to tell you that every Filipino who encounters a foreign retiree is calculating how to extract money from him. That is not what I experienced. That is not a fair account of the country. What I experienced was one specific scheme constructed by 2 specific people that exploited a structural vulnerability in Philippine property law, and my own confidence that preparation was the same thing as protection. Those are 2 different problems, so if you are watching this because you are considering buying or building property in the Philippines, and I know you are, because I was you, in 2022, reading the same forums I read, building the same spreadsheet, here is what I would tell you. Hire an attorney before any money moves. Not the agent's attorney. Not the attorney recommended by the person selling you the property. Your attorney, found independently, retained to work for you. Pay them before anything else. This is not an optional step. In any country where you do not have full and independent legal standing as a property owner, and in the Philippines, as a foreigner, you do not, the documentation is the only protection you have, and documentation drafted by people with a conflict of interest is not protection. It is exposure. Verify the title yourself at the Registry of Deeds before any transfer, not from a photocopy someone hands you. Have your attorney check for encumbrances, existing loans, and any restrictions on the registered owner's ability to convey. This costs very little. The researcher who pulled my records charged me 500 pesos, 8 euros. I paid this amount after the damage was done. I should have paid it before. And understand that a notarized document in the Philippines is not the same as a notarized document in Germany, or in England, or anywhere with a centralized notarial system. Notarization here confirms identity and signature. It does not confirm that the document is legally sufficient, correctly drafted, or enforceable in the specific way you need it to be. This is the gap in which Reginald and Maribel worked. This is where I lost the house. I do not regret pursuing the legal case. I want to be clear about this. I recovered the property. I sold it. I did not simply absorb the loss and leave quietly because the process was inconvenient and the country was foreign, and it seemed easier to go home. It was not easier. It cost me money and 14 months of my life, and a significant quantity of the tolerance for bureaucratic delay that I thought I had developed over 27 years of IT help desk work. But a broken system that wins uncontested is more dangerous than the money. Other people use that system. They will encounter Reginald, or someone like Reginald, and the question of whether the scheme can succeed will depend partly on whether anyone has ever challenged it, and made it fail. I made it fail, at considerable personal expense. I think this was correct. I pause here because there is one more thing, and it is harder to say than anything else I have told you today. I miss having someone to cook for. That is all I will say about that. I am 61 years old. I live in Bochum. I walk in the mornings. The numbers work, if less comfortably. I have the coffee press and the 2 ceramic mugs from the Colin Street night market, and I use them every day, and I don't think about why I kept them. That is where I am. That is the story. And now the host of Inside the Philippines takes over for a moment, because there are some things Wolfgang's story is telling you that go beyond what one man can say about himself. What you've just heard is not primarily a story about romance or deception in the way this channel usually tells those stories. It's a story about a structural vulnerability that exists for every foreigner who wants to live in the Philippines and put down roots, literally and otherwise. Foreign nationals cannot own land here. This is the law. The workarounds that exist are real, and they can work, but only when the documentation is airtight and prepared by someone whose loyalty is entirely to you. Wolfgang did almost everything right. He researched. He counter-proposed instead of just lending money. He read the agreement. He documented the build meticulously. He just trusted the wrong people at the one moment when independent verification was non-negotiable, when the document that would protect him was being written by people who had an interest in it, not protecting him quite well enough. One attorney. Before any money moves. That is the lesson this episode exists to deliver. If you found Wolfgang's story useful, and I hope it was, because he paid for this knowledge so you don't have to, please share this video with someone you know who's considering the move. The Philippines is a genuinely beautiful country, with genuinely good people in it, and it deserves to be experienced by foreigners who understand what they're walking into. That's what Inside the Philippines is for. Wolfgang, thank you. We appreciate you telling it honestly. We'll see you in the next one.